There's a certain type of character which we only look for when we see that they are poorly written. And no, it's not necessarily a Mary Sue, but her long-lost cousin, the self-insert. There's something weird about how this particular character archetype is distinguished, and I think it warrants an open discussion. Today, we're talking about the self-insert character, and why it's not always necessarily a bad thing to do. I think I have a different perspective on this type of character than most people tend to on YouTube, but while my perspective is different, and I believe I have something new to add to the discussion around self-inserts, I don't think I have all of the answers either. That being said, the core of my general beliefs about the self-insert character is that they're less of a bad thing to do in writing as much as they are simply a byproduct of a greater issue in writing. And sometimes a supposed self-insert character is only perceived as such if certain critics have an agenda to push and a story or character they wish to submit on the basis of some sort of objective truth about writing or whatever. I think the term self-insert is generally used on female characters more than it is for male characters, and I personally have to wonder why that is. The very obvious answer is just sexism, to which a certain demographic of my audience is now swarming the comment section while they Google examples of male self-inserts to prove me wrong. But like I said, I don't claim to have all of the answers, nor do I think that this issue can be boiled down to one singular reason. However, I do think there is a sizable amount of rhetoric surrounding the self-insert, and that the term has been hijacked by people who often love to argue things like, "The West has fallen," and "Hollywood writers are spoiled narcissists." And it's kind of funny to me that some people will adopt those exact same talking points without ever once questioning why they believe in those talking points to begin with. Just because there is a valid argument to be made for a character being a self-insert, that does not make the argument true. Now, you might be confused by what I just said, or even angered, thinking I'm talking out of my ass. So I'll elaborate. There is a difference between something which is a valid argument and something which is the logical truth. An argument can be valid without being logically true. For example, if I said 1 equals 2, 3 equals 1, therefore 1 equals 3, that would be a valid argument. However, we all know that's not the truth. In fact, 1 does not equal 2, nor does it equal 3. This premises is something that I've created myself, and it has a certain degree of logic to be followed, but in the end, it is still untruthful. I find a lot of the arguments centered around critique and rhetoric to be like this. Their arguments have a certain degree of logic, and they are valid, but once you broaden their argument past the conditions that they have provided for you, it becomes easy to see that their premises simply isn't true in the first place, and therefore their argument is null and void. Oftentimes we see the logic of Hollywood writers are narcissistic writers. Narcissistic writers use self-inserts. Therefore, Hollywood writers use self-inserts, and using a self-insert makes you a narcissist. And this logic carries over to pretty much anything these people want to complain about. Just replace Hollywood writer with fan fiction writer, or forced diversity writer, or game writers, or authors, or just writers in general. The logic is also circular, with one fact perpetuating the other endlessly to the point that you don't know which part starts which. In reality, the truth is that not all writers are narcissistic, just some of them. And most writers don't use self-inserts either. Additionally, I'd argue that a self-insert is not always the mark of a bad writer or a ego-driven writer. So this argument completely fails at every angle once you look outside the boundaries that have been set by the critic. In order to make this argument truthful, you would need to know each and every writer who used a self-insert, their clinical diagnosis of narcissism, and the hard truth that no self-insert is ever well written. But we might be shouting that it's just a term of phrase, an opinion, right? And yes, that's definitely just that, an opinion. They're not the truth, nor are they founded on facts, and yet those opinions are treated as if they are facts about writing and the people who write. So yes, this argument that self-inserts are bad because they are the byproduct of ego-driven writers is a valid argument, the premises that it's set upon is untruthful. Writers draw upon their own experiences when they write characters, whether those experiences are first, second, or third hand. My question is, at what point does a character become a self-insert? And is it not a fallacy to say that a self-insert is always bad? What if the person who inserts themselves as a character in their own story is actually a pretty cool guy? What if the self-insert is a part of the messaging and themes of the story? What if you wouldn't know the character was a self-insert unless you knew the person who wrote it in the first place? Writers will insert other people from their lives as characters. Some writers will make characters exactly like the people they know, but only change their names, and maybe their appearance a little. And yet no one complains that these characters are poorly written. In fact, I think a lot of people would consider a perfect recapturing of a real person's personality and traits to be a well-written character. So then, what do we think of when we think of bad self-inserts? I think this sort of thing stems from role-playing and fanfiction circles. Amateur and beginner writers not yet knowing how to change and reform their personalities and experiences to fit a completely different character from themselves. Or people who simply want to live their own tailor-made fantasy in a story of their own creation. Escape into a world they've inserted themselves into so that they can live out everything they've ever wanted. But isn't it the selfish escapism and power fantasy that's the real issue here? Is it not neglecting the other aspects of the world and its depth to suit your own emotional needs as a writer? The lack of flaws and conflicts introduced when we see a bad self-insert? Self-inserts only seem to be bad for two reasons. The writer is blind to their own flaws and only seeks to live out a power fantasy, or someone else thinks the writer is doing that because they don't like the character they wrote about. You see it online all the time. People look at poorly written characters only to post side-by-sides of the author and said poorly written character. Sometimes the resemblance is uncanny. Most of the time, however, it's a stretch. And once again, when does a character who draws upon the writer's experiences become a self-insert? How much of a difference must a character have to the writer in order to no longer be considered a self-insert by readers? The answer seems to be only so long as the reader can tolerate your character's bullshit. If the reader likes your character, they're not even going to question whether or not it's a self-insert. If they don't like your character, however, they will endlessly dig and reach for any and all evidence they can to support the fact that they may or may not be a self-insert. And that is why you are a bad writer. But I also think that the term self-insert is admittedly a convenient one to describe the vibes of a certain character. One which seems to be out of place in their own stories, or who always seem to have the spotlight and the correct opinion, even if their opinion might actually be dogshit. But in the end, why does it matter if a character is a self-insert or not? Can we not instead judge the character on its own merits regardless of whether or not their personality might resemble the author's to a T? Can we not point to the other flaws about how the character relates to its world? Must we always dismiss diverse characters simply because those characters make us uncomfortable, especially when the authors happen to be the same race, gender, or sexuality as those characters that they write about? My point is, when someone brings up a self-insert in the discourse of a particular story or piece of media, I often find their critique is simply just a mask to take shots at diverse characters. People who believe that the inclusion of minorities or different types of people somehow takes away from their own enjoyment of a certain story or franchise. Some people are far too invested in whether or not a character is deserving of the spotlight, feeling as if their toys are being taken away from them when in reality they were never entitled to anything to begin with. The same person who will tell minority groups to make their own characters only to throw a tantrum when those minority groups do exactly that. Whenever someone claims that a character is a poorly written character because of politics, you should be aware that whoever is making that critique is making it through a political lens. As much as those types of critics may want to deceive you into believing that they are apolitical, an apolitical critic would not be judging a character through some sort of perceived politics. I ask again, what specifically makes a self-insert bad writing? I think there are some fair points to be made. For example, a self-insert could make it easy for the writer to lionize themselves. A writer who is in control of the story would also be a character with an unfair advantage compared to everyone else in the story. But it doesn't necessarily have to be that way either. And what if the exaggerated lionization of a self-insert is part of the appeal for that character? Something that is played for comedic effect rather than something serious. And yet we can also argue that someone who is using a self-insert unironically is bad. And this is another fair point to make. If the author is not aware of the tropes they are using, then their writing can suffer for it. But isn't that true for pretty much anything the writer writes about? Being aware of tropes helps a writer better use those tropes, after all. I think there are plenty of examples of well-told and well-written stories with confirmed self-inserts in them. Toby Fox is the dog that you see at certain levels in Undertale, and he has gone on record to confirm as much that the dog is a self-insert of him. In fact, there are plenty of video games where developers will insert themselves as either an Easter egg or some sort of comedic gag. Stan Lee will often insert themselves into their own Marvel stories, and nobody really complains about that. But then we can go ahead and make the argument that those self-inserts are fine because they are played as a joke and they're also out of the way. They're not fine when they're the main protagonist. After all, a writer with a big enough ego to make themselves the main characters of their own story is likely going to create a bad character. But then again, there are also stories like Dante's Inferno, which are still regarded as good stories, and a lot of inspiration for popular media surrounding what hell looks like comes from Dante's Inferno, not the Bible. And yet, Dante, the character, is a self-insert of Dante, the writer. I list these particular examples off because they are ones in which most people will at least have a basic understanding of. But there are quite a few more examples in the fanfiction writing space. In fact, a lot of Pokemon fanfictions are really well written, and quite a few of them do a better job than the official works. And quite a few of them are also self-insert stories. My point in all of this is not really to decry the critics for using a self-insert as a talking point or a critique. I think it can save some time in describing a character who seems a bit too much like the writer themselves. No, my point is to say that self-inserts are not the core of the issue when it comes to somebody's writing. It doesn't really get to the heart of why a certain character is bad, just that they feel like something else. It's not a self-insert issue because there is no real distinguishing line between a character who is a self-insert and a character who is simply drawing upon the writer's perspective and personality traits. I find that characters I write could also be considered self-inserts in one way or another if I really wanted to stretch myself into that definition. However, even if some characters may share similarities to me, I still think of them as completely different people from myself when I'm writing them. That's why I personally find it strange when people go out of their way to compare the new Mary Jane from the new Spider-Man game to someone who isn't even on the writing team, or to compare the writer of I'm Not Starfire to the main character of that same book. Perhaps they look similar, but just because you don't like the character, that doesn't necessarily mean they are poorly written or that they are self-inserts. It's okay to just not like a character, guys. Like, seriously, you don't need to justify it. Trying to present your opinion of a character as something factual is unnecessary. It's best to use these critiques to describe why you don't like something personally, rather than standing atop a soapbox and pretending as if a particular style of writing is somehow ruining the quality of all stories everywhere. Your opinion does not need to be everyone else's for it to be valid, and sometimes something you read was simply not written for you. I think you would spend a lot less energy finding the things that you enjoy rather than constantly seeking out things you dislike to fight in some sort of culture war for people who do not care about you or know you. But these are my thoughts on the topic. And while I would describe myself as progressive and left-leaning, I'm also not here to shame anyone for having more conservative views. After all, I used to think in the exact same way, which is why I feel I understand the thought process behind it, and why I think it's still valid even if it has its logical pitfalls. I think it's more productive to make you ponder why you should have those beliefs in the first place, as opposed to just being your parent and telling you what's right or wrong. I don't have all the answers, and I don't think I ever will. However, if somebody's answers come from a person who presents as if they have all the answers, and yet they're almost always speculating and going on random tangents about wokeism, then I wouldn't trust that person. Not just because I disagree with their political beliefs, but also because they haven't really thought enough on the topic that they're talking about to hesitate about what they're saying. Someone who refuses to grant any merits to the other side of opinions is also someone who is trying to deceive you into believing exactly what they believe. These people will often paint a picture of blue hair, pronounced social justice warriors and a bunch of soy boy white knights defending them. They'll try to demonize the other side, and then they'll tell you that they're the ones being demonized. They will tell you that believing what SJWs believes means that stories will no longer be well written, and you will no longer enjoy anything that comes out, just like them. In reality, political alignment has almost no bearing on the quality of a story. Even if someone may disagree with the message of a story, we can still enjoy that story on its more objective merits. And even if a story is poorly written, that can be true regardless of which side the political spectrum the writer falls under. Having conservative values does not make you a better writer, nor does being a progressive person. What makes us better writers is practice and experience, and it always will be. Experience which you will never get if all you ever do is criticize others and speculate on political alignments. If you strive to be a writer one day, then stop worrying about Hollywood. Stop worrying about diversity hires and self-inserts, and instead worry about how you're going to tell your own story. Draw upon your experiences and put a piece of yourself into what you make. Insert yourself into a new document and start writing.